Let me explain something to everybody. This is a very, and when I say very, I can't explain to you what a unique opportunity this is.
Don't f***ing talk shit, you fatherless bastard. Just shut your f***ing mouth.
That's not cool, dude. Come on, man. Chris, come on.
I want him.
Chris, come on, guys. Come on, dude. Get the...
Live for the first time on cable television. It's gotta be the craziest war I think I've ever seen.
Conceive, believe, achieve. Shut the fuck up.
I know his mama got tickets. Don't talk about my mom for one. Don't you ever talk about my mom.
1, 2, 3. Fuck the Mayweathers.
I'm not scared of anyone.
I'm not surprised, motherfuckers.
The UFC, right? They've millions of followers across a number of different social media platforms. They have TV deals all around the world. They're setting pay-per-view buy rate records year after year. And if you're not familiar with the UFC, you might say, this has always been the case.
That is allowed in this competition. That is brutal.
Nah, not quite. The UFC is an MMA promotion, but MMA didn't exist when UFC started. So the UFC didn't really know what it was. The lack of rules, identity and structure basically made it the closest you could possibly get to no-holds-barred fighting without anyone dropping dead in the octagon. Senator John McCain eventually watched the UFC and actually, he hated it. He absolutely hated it. He referred to it as human cockfighting and wrote to all 50 US states trying to ban it. 36 states agreed that it was illegal, and with the UFC now illegal in most of America, the owners ended up selling it to the Fertitta brothers alongside their friend Dana White. But despite new ownership, by 2005 they were $34 million in debt. The UFC were faced with the very real prospect of folding. They needed something new, something drastic, something different to save it from its downfall. They needed...
Take care of your underwears. I'm gonna you, man.
The Ultimate Fighter, a reality show where 16 fighters compete to get a UFC contract and one fighter gets kicked off the show each week. Literally. The show was a massive success, 2.6 million people tuned in to watch the finale, and it changed the trajectory of the UFC forever. But why was it such a big success? There's a variety of reasons. Firstly, was how they targeted their chosen demographic. It aired on free TV. This meant that anyone flicking through the channels could stumble across it and watch it, instead of specifically going out of their way to pay $30 for the pay-per-view. Secondly, it aired on Spike TV. If you don't know what Spike TV was, it was basically the lads channel. They had the 18 to 34 male demographic nailed down. The show aired on Monday nights directly after WWE Raw, and ultimately the decision to broadcast on this channel at this time turned out to be one of the key factors behind the success of the show. But it wasn't the only one. Developing emotional connections. The Ultimate Fighter's key purpose was to educate potential new fans about the sport of MMA. They could have done this through documentary, but they chose to do this through reality TV. However, in doing so, they still took elements from documentary when telling their stories. The biggest example of this would be the sit-down interview. The direct address interview shows emotional intimacy, sympathy for the speaker, a sense of their interiority, what John Dovey calls the first-person media effect, a theory that can be linked to immediacy because of the realistic feeling that the audience feels through the interview. An example of this working in full effect would be when Chris Lieben had an altercation with Josh Koscheck and Bobby Southworth in Season 1. Lieben decided to sleep outside by himself in his sleeping bag. Koscheck and Southworth came out and sprayed him with a hose, and as an emotional, teary Chris Lieben loses his temper and shows how upset he is, a smug Koscheck says in a sit-down interview,
"I'm an instigator, you know, and I instigated it, and, you know, when you have a few cocktails, of course, you want to see how far you can push somebody to see what they're going to do next."
That little dickhead. But that's the point. Whether it makes the viewer angry because they see an arrogant young man bullying Chris Lieben, or they find it funny that someone has caused Chris Lieben to lose his temper and lash out, the viewer now either loves or hates Josh Koscheck. An emotional connection has been established between the viewer and the fighter they're watching. They now have a reason to want to watch these two men fight and see out the conclusion of their story. This formula is something that carried the viewers from week to week and contributed massively to the success of the show. Casting. There's a clip from the start of Season 1 where Dana White addresses his fighters, and he says,
We picked who we believe are the best guys in this country right now. We did. And you guys are it.
Well, that's a lie. In amongst the Season 1 cast was a man called Jason Tacker. Would you like to know how many fights Jason Tacker has had at this point in his career? Zero. None. Not one. In 2005, I had the same MMA record that Jason Tucker had. And I was 6! This man had the same MMA record as a 6-year-old. Even today, 17 years later, he has never won a fight. How can this man be the best in the country when he's clearly not the best, and he's not even in the country? But that's the point. There were many legitimate prospects on the show, from Mike Swick to Kenny Florian to Nate Quarry, but fighting ability wasn't the only thing taken into account when casting who should be on this show. While Chris Lieben, Josh Koscheck and Forrest Griffin were all excellent fighters, they also covered the personality side of the show to ensure that the cast were entertaining as well as talented. Jason Tucker, however, is the most obvious example, with Tucker himself even hearing producers choose him over Jason McDonald, a legitimate MMA prospect, because McDonald had a boring personality. Manufacturing conflict. Another factor behind the success of The Ultimate Fighter was the producer's ability to manufacture conflict. While the show wasn't scripted, like many reality shows, the producers of The Ultimate Fighter used a number of different methods to generate conflict. This included splitting the fighters into teams and having them compete in challenges outside of their usual fights, cutting off their communication to the outside world, and offering them free alcohol to drink in the house whenever they wanted. This resulted in a consistent stream of altercations and incidents that made the viewer want to keep watching. Finally, the payoff. After months of building towards it, the final fight aired on the 9th of April 2005. It featured Forrest Griffin taking on Stefan Bonner, and while this isn't something that can be scripted, the fight ended up being regarded even to this day as arguably the greatest fight to ever take place in the UFC. Both men were evenly matched, both had an exciting style, and both men now had the platform to showcase to new fans what the UFC consists of. And in the end, both men were given contracts despite only one contract being promised to the winner because the fight was that good. The fight was seen by 2.6 million viewers, and it launched the UFC into the mainstream. But does that formula look familiar? The days of The Ultimate Fighter drawing in millions of viewers are long behind us, but today, the UFC are still setting record profits, and in the era of social media, are there similarities between how the UFC promoted itself through The Ultimate Fighter back in 2005 and how they promote themselves now? Identifying target demographics. The UFC were one of the first major sporting organisations to fully embrace social media when they started streaming selected fights for free on Facebook. In the same way that airing on free TV allowed new fans to accidentally encounter The Ultimate Fighter when they were changing through the channels, social media allows new fans to accidentally stumble across the UFC when scrolling through their newsfeed. And in the same way that Spike TV's core demographic matched that of the UFC, the same could also be said about social media. As of June 2017, Facebook has over 2 billion users, 35% of which being men between 18 and 34. Twitter has over 300 million users, with 37% of them being between 18 and 39, and a further 25% being between 30 and 49. It's the exact demographic that the UFC are targeting. Developing emotional connections. In The Ultimate Fighter, sit-down interviews were integral to developing an emotional connection between the viewer and the fighters they are watching. But the UFC haven't stopped using these interviews just because there's no reality show. In the build-up to a major event, the UFC produce a vlog series called UFC Embedded. These are a series of videos which give the fans a closer, behind-the-scenes look at the fighters as they prepare for the event. It features interviews which humanize the fighters and allows the viewer to judge them as a person rather than just a fighter. It gives them a reason to root for their success or demise. For example, instead of just rolling out a promising young fighter in his UFC debut and saying, yeah, he's pretty good, they show the fighter talking about their story and the adversity they've had to overcome through life. They then put this out for free on YouTube and social media to attract as many viewers as possible and make them care about the fighter to the point where they might actually buy the pay-per-view to see if that fighter wins or loses. Another unique aspect of the UFC which develops an emotional connection between fans and the fighters is press conferences. However, this also ties in with the next point: manufacturing conflict. In the post-Ultimate Fighter era, the UFC still manages to find ways to manufacture conflict out of nothing. Two really common methods are face-offs and post-fight interviews. Face-offs generally take place at the weigh-ins. The two fighters stand head-to-head while the media take pictures. There really is no need for this serious dramatic stare down. They could instead just give each other pizza or exchange t-shirts with each other's faces on them or beat up a piñata instead. Well, actually, Sean O'Connell did all those things. He was a pretty weird guy. But the point is that they get fighters to stare each other down, and if words are exchanged or things get physical, it gets posted all over social media and generates a buzz before the fight. Post-fight interviews are the same. They don't need to happen. The fight is over, there's press conferences afterwards anyways, but when the adrenaline is flowing, they may end up saying something like,
Anderson Silva, you absolutely suck.
which again gets put on social media for as many people to see as possible to get them emotionally invested, either because they now want to see the fighter get smashed or because they want to see the other fighter respond to the call out. Press conferences, however, this is the UFC's primary method of manufacturing conflict and getting the audience emotionally invested at the same time. UFC press conferences are a whole different world to the usual sports press conference. That is, unless Harry Kane decides to verbally annihilate his opponents before breaking out into a pull-apart brawl. Fighters don't get punished for swearing or being disrespectful in a press conference. If anything, they get rewarded. The most obvious example of this is the success of Conor McGregor. Every press conference for him was as important as the fight. No matter who he fought, he would always make sure to attack them verbally beforehand. Not just because it might get into their heads, but because the viewer watching it would either love him or hate him as a result. This is why, despite Conor McGregor having as many title defenses as Jason Tacker, is still, based on pay-per-view and social media numbers, the biggest star in the history of the sport. Casting. Speaking of Jason Tacker, in The Ultimate Fighter it was evident that fighting ability wasn't the only aspect when taking into account casting the fighters. However, the same could still be said about the UFC today. Sean O'Malley is not a world champion or an elite level fighter, but he does have over 2 million more Instagram followers than a fighter typically has at his level. As a result, he is always booked on the main cards of the biggest shows. When the UFC goes to a different country, the card is usually filled with local fighters from that particular country because it sells more tickets. When Dustin Poirier knocked out Conor McGregor and made himself the next undisputed challenger for the title, all parties agreed to have a rematch instead because it made more money. They even booked CM Punk, a 37-year-old man with zero combat experience, because he was a former WWE champion. As in, where the fights are scripted. He lost in 2 minutes and the UFC made a lot of money. The show had a buy rate of 475,000. That's over 300,000 more than when Demetrius Johnson or Amanda Nunes last main evented a pay-per-view, despite both of those fighters being arguably the greatest of all time in their respective weight class. The payoff in this case is any fight, really. Although the fights were never the issue. The fights were always there, even back when Joe Son was getting uppercuts in the balls. But the challenge isn't just putting on a good show, it's attracting as many new fans to that show as possible. The UFC discovered how to do that back in 2005 with The Ultimate Fighter, and the lessons they learned from that are still applied to this day through social media.